heard it before I saw it. A wet, dragging tread in the dark, as if something heavy and half-lame drew its weight through the flooded leaf mold. The air grew sour, like spoiled meat left in a closed room. Our fire snapped and sank, though there was no wind. Then the trees parted soundlessly, and I watched a single red, lidless eye open in the center of a matted, breathing mass. Men have pressed me for this account in the years since, as though the telling might grant them some second-hand courage. I offer it now with reservations, and ask only that, if you find some value in these recollections, you lend your support, mark your approval, and set down your own thoughts and tales for those who come after. To understand what we encountered, I must return to the winter of 1907, when the Amazon still lay, for most Europeans, as a vague green emptiness on the map, broken only by the sinuous line of the great river and the names of trading posts. I was then a young man of 30, a surveyor by training, engaged by a consortium of rubber interests in Manaus to accompany an expedition up the Rio Purus and into the headwaters of the Rio Acre. Our leader was Captain Arthur Henderson, late of the Royal Engineers, a tall, spare Englishman whose moustache seemed carved rather than grown. He had served in South Africa and brought with him a soldier's habit of order and a certain impatience with what he called jungle superstitions. Beside him, there was Dr. Émile Charpentier, a French naturalist in his 40s, already known for his catalogues of Amazonian insects. I was engaged as surveyor and draftsman. We had also 2 Brazilian boatmen, João and Miguel, and 3 indigenous men from near Manaus, of the Baré people, who knew the river and its moods far better than we. Our purpose, as stated in our papers, was to chart a practicable route between the rubber stands along the upper Purus and the smaller tributaries that might offer access further west. Unstated, but understood by all, was the desire to find unclaimed groves of Hevea brasiliensis and to secure, by treaty or otherwise, the labor to work them. It was the fashion then to cloak such ventures in the language of science, and to that end, Charpentier had secured the patronage of a Parisian society, whose crest he had sewn rather proudly upon his satchel. We left Manaus on 3rd June 1907, aboard a shallow draft steamer, the São Martinho, her decks piled with crates of tinned meat, sacks of farinha, rifles wrapped in oiled cloth, a brass theodolite, compasses, kerosene lanterns, and lengths of canvas for tents. The river at that season was high, the forests on either bank appearing as a continuous wall of green, broken only by occasional clearings where smoke rose and children stood to watch us pass. For the first weeks, our progress was uneventful. We rose before dawn, took coffee and hard biscuit, and then set to work with compass and notebook while the boatman minded the current. The jungle's sounds were a constant backdrop, the buzzing of insects, the high, thin calls of unseen birds, the hooting of monkeys. At night, when we tied up along some muddy bank, the chorus deepened to include frogs and the occasional cough of a jaguar far off. It was on the 10th day, when we had left behind the last sizable settlement, that we first heard the word that would come to haunt me. We had stopped at a small village of thatched huts, raised on stilts above the floodplain. Henderson wished to secure fresh fruit and perhaps a guide who knew the interior. The people there spoke a tongue I did not know, but one of our Baré men, Paulo, could make himself understood, while Henderson and Charpentier haggled over cassava and smoked fish, I sat upon an upturned crate and sketched the curve of the river, the arrangement of the huts, more from habit than need. An old man, his hair white as river foam, and his lower lip distended by some ornament long since removed, watched me draw. After a time he spoke, pointing first to the river, then to the forest behind the village, then to my face. Paulo translated in a halting fashion. He says the river is good, but the forest there is forbidden. He says there is one who walks, a great one, Mapinguari. I had heard many such names in my brief time in Brazil. Curupira, Boto, Yara, spirits and monsters that haunted the edges of settlements and the minds of those who depended upon the forest. I smiled and sketched a little caricature of a giant man striding between trees to amuse the old fellow. He did not smile. His eyes, clouded with age, fixed upon mine with a seriousness that unsettled me more than his words. He took the charcoal from my hand, and upon the back of my map drew with surprising firmness a shape, a bulky, hunched figure, one arm long, one short, and in the center of its torso a single staring eye. Where I would have expected a mouth, he drew instead a dark oval upon the belly, ringed with small strokes like teeth. He spoke again, more urgently, and Paulo's voice grew hushed as he relayed it. He says it smells of death before it comes. The animals go silent. It is old, very old. It hates the cutting of trees. It does not like fire. He says we must not go where its tracks are, or it will follow. Henderson, returning at that moment with a string of plantains over his shoulder, laughed when he saw the drawing. Ghost stories, he said. Every wilderness has them. In the Sudan, it was the Afrit. In India, the Rakshasa. Men give the unknown a face, that is all. Charpentier, however, slipped the paper into his satchel with an odd, speculative look. Still, he said, it is a curious thing. Many tribes in this basin speak of a great, shaggy man of the forest. An atavistic memory, perhaps, of some extinct beast. Megatherium, or something akin. At that time, I sided with Henderson. The old man's drawing was a curiosity, nothing more. Had I understood the weight of that crude charcoal line, I might have insisted we turn back then. But we were young, confident, and the forest, for all its dangers, still seemed to us a place to be measured and mastered. That night, as we lay in our hammocks strung beneath the São Martinho's awning, João passed around a small bottle of cachaça. The air was thick and warm, the stars veiled by high cloud. Henderson spoke of his wife in Surrey, who had written to say that their eldest boy had taken to collecting beetles in the garden. He insists on keeping them in matchboxes, Henderson said, with a fond exasperation that softened his usual severity. My wife is forever finding them in his pockets. I told her I would bring him back some monstrous Amazonian specimen to cure him of the habit. Charpentier chuckled and raised his tin cup. 2 monstrous specimens, then, and to making our names in the annals of science. They turned to me, and I, feeling the warmth of the spirits and the companionship, spoke of my sister in Lisbon, who had married a clerk and written of the sea air and the cries of gulls. I confessed that I had taken this commission in part to send money home, in part because the thought of returning to the narrow streets of my youth filled me with a restlessness I could not name. We were, for that brief hour, only men among men, speaking of home and hopes and the small foolishnesses that tied us to the world beyond the forest. It is that memory, as much as any other, that sharpens what followed. For dread gains its power not in isolation, but in contrast to the ordinary life it threatens to take. 3 days after leaving the village, the São Martinho could go no further. The river narrowed and grew choked with floating vegetation. Henderson called us to the chart table and spread out the map. "From here," he said, tapping the blank space beyond the last marked bend, "we go by canoe. 2 dugouts, supplies for 3 weeks, no more. We follow this tributary," he indicated a thin, crooked line, "until it bends west. That should bring us within reach of the rubber stands reported by the traders." The Barre men exchanged glances at the sight of the indicated tributary. Paolo spoke softly. "That is the way the old man warned us against, Capitan. He said the Mapinguari walks there." Henderson's jaw tightened. "I will not have this expedition governed by the fears of village elders," he said. "The shortest route is the best. We shall keep our fires high at night and our rifles clean. That is protection enough." There was a brief silence. I remember feeling a small, unarticulated unease, but it seemed then a lesser thing than the weight of Henderson's authority and the demands of our commission. We loaded the canoes. The tributary was narrower, its banks pressing close, the trees leaning over as though to confer. Sunlight reached us only in broken shafts, and the air beneath the canopy was cooler, though heavy with moisture. Vines trailed in the water like drowned hair. We paddled in single file, the lead canoe with Henderson and 2 of the Barre men, the second with myself, Charpentier, and Miguel. Our rifles lay within easy reach upon the thwarts, wrapped in their oiled cloths. It was on the 2nd day along that waterway that I first noticed an absence. In the morning, the forest had been as noisy as ever. By midday, however, a strange hush fell. The ceaseless insect hum diminished, the bird calls grew sporadic, and even the chatter of monkeys seemed to recede. "Do you hear that?" I asked Charpentier, keeping my voice low without quite knowing why. He cocked his head, his paddle resting across his knees. "I hear very little," he said. "It is as if we have passed some invisible line. Curious." Henderson called back from the leading canoe. "Save your curiosity for the specimens, Doctor. This is merely a change in habitat. Paddle." We obeyed, yet the silence persisted, a soft pressure upon the ears. Once, a distant crash of undergrowth sounded to our right, as if some large animal moved parallel to us within the trees. We all turned our heads, but saw nothing. Henderson dismissed it as a tapir, or perhaps a herd of peccaries. That night, we made camp upon a slight rise above the water, where the ground was marginally less sodden. The Barre men erected a simple shelter of palm fronds, under which we strung our hammocks. We set a small fire, more for cooking than warmth, for the air was still close and humid. As we ate our salted meat and cassava, a smell came to us upon the faint stirring of air. It was subtle at first, a sourness beneath the usual odors of damp earth and decaying vegetation. Gradually, it thickened, until it lay upon the camp like a film. It was the smell of carrion, but not the clean, sharp scent of a single dead animal. Rather, it was as though many things had died and rotted in a confined space. Miguel swore softly and covered his mouth with his hand. "Alguma coisa morta," he muttered. "Something dead." Henderson sniffed the air and frowned. "There must be a carcass nearby," he said. "In the morning, we shall move camp a little further along. For now, keep the fire stoked. Predators will be drawn to the smell." The beret men exchanged another of those glances that I had begun by then to recognize as the physical expression of some unspoken agreement. Paolo spoke in a low voice. "Capitan, this is not right. The smell, it comes and goes. It is not the same as a dead thing. We should not stay." Henderson's patience, already frayed by the day's exertions, snapped. "You will stay," he said, his voice hard. "We are not children to be frightened by every change of wind. Keep the fire high, that is all." There was no more argument. Yet that night, as I lay in my hammock and watched the shadows thrown by the fire upon the palm leaves above me, I could not keep from sniffing the air, searching for that sour undertone. At times, it seemed to recede, leaving only the honest smells of smoke and wet earth. Then, without warning, it would return, stronger than before, so that I could almost taste it at the back of my throat. Sometime in the darkest hours, when the fire had burned low and the forest lay in that peculiar half-silence, I woke with the distinct sensation that something pressed upon the air around us. It was not a sound, nor a movement, but rather the absence of both. The insects had ceased altogether. Even the frogs were still. The only noise was the faint crackle of embers. I raised myself upon one elbow and peered out. The embers cast a dull red glow, just enough to show the trunks of the nearest trees and the pale shapes of the canoes drawn up upon the bank. I saw nothing unusual, yet the hair upon my arms stood up, and a chill ran along my spine despite the heat. Then, from somewhere beyond the circle of our camp, there came a sound, a low, drawn-out moan, deep as if it rose from some great hollow chest. It was not the roar of a jaguar, nor the whoop of a monkey, nor any of the familiar cries of the forest. It was slow, almost ponderous, and there was in it an odd, choking quality, as if whatever made it had forgotten how to use its own voice. The sound rose, held, and then broke off abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard the creak of a hammock as someone else shifted, and the soft click of a rifle being thumbed off safe. "Jaguar." Henderson's voice came softly from the darkness, too quickly. "Go back to sleep." No one answered. After a time, the insects resumed their chorus, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The sour smell faded. I lay awake until the sky began to pale, listening for a repetition that did not come. In the morning, we found tracks. They were in the soft mud just beyond where our canoes lay, half filled with the water that had seeped in overnight. I saw them first as a series of depressions, irregular and overlapping, as though several heavy men had walked there barefoot. But when we cleared away the leaves and debris, a pattern emerged. Each print was broad, almost circular, perhaps 20 inches across. Sunk deep into the mud as if under tremendous weight. There were no distinct toes that I could see, only a general flattening at one end, as though a great padded foot had pressed there. They ran in a line parallel to the camp, then veered off into the undergrowth, where the ground grew too tangled to show them clearly. Charpentier knelt beside one and placed his hand within it. His fingers spread wide could not reach the edges. "Mon Dieu," he murmured. "It is too large for any known mammal in this region. A trick of the mud, perhaps. 2 or 3 prints overlaid." Henderson, standing with his rifle cradled in his arms, shook his head. "A bear, perhaps," he said. "There are reports of bears in these forests." "Not of this size," Charpentier replied. "And the gait is wrong. See how the prints fall almost in a straight line, one before the other, as if the legs were set close together. A man walks so. Most quadrupeds do not. The Baré men had drawn back, their faces set. Mapinguari, Paolo whispered. It has passed here. I told myself then that it must be some unknown animal, a large tapir perhaps, or a freakish specimen of some other beast, its tracks distorted by the mud and my own lack of familiarity. I insisted upon this explanation in my mind, though it sat uneasily there, like a guest who will not meet one's eye. We moved camp that day, pushing further along the tributary. The silence in the forest returned, on and off, like the drawing and releasing of a breath. Sometimes the usual sounds would swell around us, and for an hour we might almost forget. Then, without warning, the air would grow still, the calls would cease, and that faint sourness would creep in again, as if something vast and unseen had turned its attention upon us. At intervals, we found more traces. A tree, its bark scored with deep, parallel grooves far higher than any man could reach. A patch of ground where the leaf litter had been disturbed, as though something had sat or lain there, leaving an oval depression larger than our hammocks. Once we came upon the carcass of a capybara, its body crushed rather than torn, the ribs caved in as if by a single immense blow. There was remarkably little blood. The flesh at its flanks had been taken in great, ragged chunks, but the head and limbs were untouched. It could be a jaguar, Henderson said, though his voice lacked conviction. They sometimes carry their prey into the trees and drop it. It has not been dragged, Charpentier observed. See, there are no marks leading to or from the body. It is as if it fell from the sky. At that remark, one of the Baré men, a younger fellow named Aru, made a sign with his fingers against evil and muttered a prayer under his breath. By the end of the first week upon that tributary, our nerves were frayed. Sleep came fitfully, broken by half-heard sounds and the constant expectation of that choking moan. Food tasted of ashes. Even Henderson's habitual briskness had taken on a brittle edge. It was upon the 8th day that the forest chose to remind us how small we truly were. We had stopped at midday to take bearings and to allow Charpentier to collect some specimens of an orchid he had spotted along the bank. The sun, such as it was, filtered down in pale shafts through the canopy. The air was heavy, but for once the usual cacophony of the forest was in full voice. It almost lulled me. I was setting up the theodolite upon a patch of relatively level ground when there came, without warning, a sharp, dry crack, like the report of a rifle from somewhere behind us. The sound was followed immediately by a deep, splintering crash. I turned in time to see, through the trees, the trunk of a great ceiba sway and begin to fall. "Look out!" Miguel shouted in Portuguese, his voice high with shock. We scattered, instinct taking over, as the massive tree came down not in our direction, but diagonally across the space where we had beached the canoes. It struck the bank with a force that shook the ground under my feet. One canoe was crushed outright, its hull splintering like a toy. The other was flung half into the water, half onto the mud. Its side stove in. For a moment, there was only the settling creak of branches and the patter of dislodged leaves. Then the forest fell utterly silent. Even the insects ceased. Henderson cursed, his face pale beneath its tan. "It must have been rotten," he said. "We were fools to camp beneath such giants. Check for injuries." We were shaken, but by some miracle unhurt. The loss of the canoes, however, was no small matter. While we stood staring at the wreckage, a smell drifted in, sudden and overpowering. That same sour stench of decay, but magnified tenfold. It was as if the very heart of some charnel house had been opened. I gagged and pressed a handkerchief to my nose. Charpentier's eyes watered behind his spectacles. "It is strongest near the tree," he managed. We approached the fallen Keba with reluctance. It lay at an angle, its massive roots torn from the earth. The wood at the break was not rotten. It was fresh and pale, the fibers torn as though by some enormous wrenching force. There was no sign of lightning, no burn marks. On the trunk itself, about 8 feet from the ground, there were marks, a series of deep impressions in the bark, arranged in a rough semicircle. They were not the clean cuts of an axe, nor the claws of any animal I knew. They were more like the prints of a huge blunt hand, each indentation the size of a man's fist. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air seemed to press upon us. Then Aru broke, dropping to his knees and babbling in his own tongue. I caught only one word, repeated over and over. "Mapinguari, Mapinguari, Mapinguari." Henderson seized him by the shoulders and shook him. "Enough!" he shouted. "We will not have hysteria. This is an accident, nothing more. The tree was weakened, a gust of wind, a shift in the earth." "There was no wind," I said, more sharply than I intended. The words hung in the charged air. Henderson turned on me, his eyes blazing. "Then what do you propose, Mr. Almeida? That some jungle bogeyman pushed it over? That we are being stalked by a ghost?" I had no answer. My heart hammered against my ribs. The rationale part of my mind clung to the idea of rot, of unseen termites, of coincidence. Yet the smell, the silence, the prints on the bark, they did not fit. In the end, practicality asserted itself. We were stranded without serviceable boats. To remain where we were was unthinkable. We set to salvaging what we could from the wreckage and fashioning a crude raft from the smaller branches of the fallen tree. It was clumsy work, and all the while that sour stench lay upon us like a reminder. That night, we built our fire larger than usual, feeding it with resinous wood until the flames leapt high. The Barret men refused to sleep, taking turns instead to sit with their backs to the blaze, watching the darkness beyond. I do not know when I finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy doze. I only know that I woke with the impression that someone had spoken my name very softly, close to my ear. The voice, if it had been a voice, was gone. The fire had burned down to coals. The forest was again in that unnatural hush. I lay very still, scarcely daring to breathe. From somewhere beyond the circle of our camp, there came a sound like the dragging of a heavy sack over wet ground. It was slow, irregular, with brief pauses, as if whatever moved there had to gather its strength between steps. The smell of decay grew almost unbearable. The sound drew nearer, then stopped. In that moment of stillness, I fancied I could hear something else. A wet, congested breathing, labored and thick. It was not the rapid panting of a predator, but rather the strained respiration of some vast creature whose own weight oppressed it. A shape loomed at the very edge of the firelight. I could not see it clearly. The coals cast only a dull glow, enough to suggest a bulk that blotted out the trunks behind it. The outline was wrong for any animal I knew. It was too tall, too upright, yet hunched, as if its spine bore some ancient burden. I thought I saw a long arm, matted with hair, reach out to rest against a tree, the fingers splayed wide. The bark creaked under the pressure. Then, in the center of that mass, something opened, a single, round, red radiance, like an ember. It was not bright, but it was focused. I felt it fix upon me where I lay, as surely as if a hand had closed upon my throat. My body refused to move. I could not cry out, could not reach for the rifle that lay an arm's length away. All my fine training, my rational mind, shrank to a single point of animal terror. The red eye, or what I took for an eye, narrowed slightly, as if in curiosity. For a moment, I had the insane impression that it was sniffing, though it did not move. The sour stench was now so strong that my eyes watered. Somewhere to my left, I heard a strangled sound as one of the beret men woke and saw. There was a rustle, the scrape of a boot, and then the sharp, panicked crack of a rifle fired blind into the dark. The report shattered the stillness. The muzzle flash lit the trees for an instant. In that brief flare, I saw more. A glimpse of coarse, reddish hair, slick in patches, as though with some secretion. A broad, barrel-like torso from which issued horribly not only the red orb, but a vertical slit lower down, ringed with pale, glistening teeth that seemed to grind against one another, even as it drew breath. Then the light died, and with it, the vision. There was a sound like a great, pained bellow, choked and furious, and the ground shook as something crashed away through the undergrowth, breaking saplings as if they were reeds. The insects remained silent. Shouts erupted in the camp. Henderson was up, rifle in hand, barking orders that no one obeyed. 2 more shots were fired into the night, wild and unaimed. The beret men huddled together, muttering prayers. Charpentier, his face ashen, clutched at my arm. "You saw it," he whispered. "Tell me I imagined it. Tell me—" "I saw," I said, my voice hoarse. "God help us. I saw." We did not sleep again that night. When dawn came, grey and thin, we moved like old men. The forest's usual noises returned, tentatively at first, then with gathering strength, as if some unseen weight had been lifted. At the edge of the camp, where the shadow had stood, we found the ground churned and the undergrowth crushed. Several saplings were bent almost double, their bark abraded at a height that made no sense. There were prints, too, deeper even than those by the river, pressed into the soft earth. They were similar in shape, but now I could see more clearly that each was not a single pad, but rather a conglomeration of smaller lobes, as if many blunt digits had been fused. On one broad leaf, torn and hanging, there was a smear of dark, viscous substance. It was not blood, or if it was unlike any blood I knew. It had a faint greenish cast and clung to the leaf like resin. When Charpentier, against my advice, touched it with the tip of his knife, it left a thin, oily film that did not readily wipe away. "That is enough," Henderson said, his voice unsteady. "We are leaving, at once. We will take only what we can carry on our backs. The rest we abandon." No one argued. In that moment, the prospect of remaining in that place, even long enough to fashion a better raft, was intolerable. We lashed together a crude platform from the lighter branches of the fallen ceiba, loaded upon it the barest essentials: rifles, ammunition, a little food, the surveying instruments, and pushed off, letting the current take us back the way we had come. The journey downriver, which had taken us 8 days to ascend, we made in 4, such was our haste. The raft rode low in the water, and more than once we were forced to wade and drag it over shallows, the mud sucking at our boots. The forest pressed close, its shadows seeming to watch. The phenomena that had plagued us did not cease. At odd hours, the forest would fall silent, and that faint, sour smell would drift over us, borne on no discernible breeze. Once, in mid-afternoon, as we rounded a bend, a flock of macaws that had been perched in a great tree above the water exploded into flight all at once, screaming, their wings beating the air like a storm. They wheeled overhead, then vanished into the canopy, leaving only a rain of feathers. Another time, we came upon a stretch of bank where the trees had been disturbed. Several young trunks leaned at an angle, their roots half torn from the earth, as though something immense had brushed past in haste. Among the impressions in the mud were our own footprints from days before. Overlaid upon them, clear and deep, were the broad circular tracks we had come to dread. "It follows," Paolo said quietly. "It does not wish to let us go." Henderson, who had taken to chewing his moustache when he thought no one watched, said nothing. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands shook slightly when he reloaded his rifle. On the second night of our retreat, the Barret men refused to make camp upon the bank. "We will sleep upon the water," Aru said, his voice firm in a way I had not heard before. The Mapinguari does not like the river. Whether this was true, or only another layer of belief, I could not say. At that point, any small reassurance was welcome. We anchored the raft in the middle of a broad, slow-moving stretch and lashed ourselves and our gear to its rough surface. The sky above was a low, unbroken grey, and the air hung heavy with impending rain. In the deepest part of the night, the sour smell came again, faint but distinct, even over the water. The insects upon the banks fell silent, and only the gentle slap of the current against the logs broke the hush. I lay there, tied to that precarious platform, and stared up into the darkness, imagining some vast shape moving along the shore, pacing us. Once, there was a sound like the snapping of a branch, followed by a low, almost conversational rumble, as if something had attempted speech and failed. The raft rocked slightly, though there was no wave. Someone sobbed softly in the dark. No one spoke. By dawn, the smell had gone. The forest's chorus resumed, as if nothing had happened. We untied ourselves with stiff fingers and paddled on. On the fourth day, we rejoined the broader Purus. The change was immediate. The river opened out, the banks receded, and with them, it seemed, some of the pressure that had lain upon us. The forest sounds, though still vast and strange, were familiar again. The sour odour did not return. When at last we caught sight of the São Martinho, where we had left her moored in a sheltered cove, my knees almost buckled with relief. The little steamer, with her peeling paint and smoke-blackened funnel, had never seemed so solid, so blessedly ordinary. Captain Rodriguez, her master, stood upon the deck with a spyglass, his brow furrowed. As our makeshift raft bumped against the hull, he stared down at us in astonishment. "By all the saints," he exclaimed, "you look like men who have seen the devil." "We have seen something," Henderson replied grimly. "Help us aboard." Once on deck, the contrast between our state and that of the crew was thrown into sharp relief. They were clean-shaven, their clothes only moderately stained by coal dust and river spray. We were gaunt, bearded, our garments torn and stained with mud and worse. There was a smell about us that made the men wrinkle their noses, though whether it was only the accumulation of days in the jungle or some faint remnant of that other odour, I could not say. In the small saloon, over cups of strong bitter coffee, Rodriguez pressed Henderson for an account. "Did you find your rubber?" he asked. "Any sign of the stands the traders spoke of?" Henderson stared into his cup for a long moment before answering. "We found nothing worth the risk," he said at last. "The interior is impassable. Swamps, fallen timber, no clear routes. We were fortunate to return at all." I watched his face as he spoke. The words were technically true, but they were also a shield. He did not mention the tracks, the smells, the thing in the night. His jaw clenched on the unsaid. Later, when Rodriguez had gone to see to the engines, we gathered in the cramped cabin that served as our chart room. Henderson closed the door and leaned against it, his shoulders sagging. "We must decide what we are to say," he began. "To Rodriguez, to the company in Manaus, to the gentlemen in Paris who await your specimens, Doctor." "There are some specimens," Charpentier said dully. "Insects, a few plants, nothing that will satisfy them, not in the face of our failure." Henderson's gaze flicked to me, then to the Barret men, who sat together on a bench, their eyes downcast. "If we speak of what we saw," he said carefully, "we shall be taken for madmen, at best for fools frightened by shadows. Our reputations will suffer. The company will say we invented monsters to excuse our retreat." "Is that not what we are doing now?" I asked. "Inventing other reasons?" He met my eyes, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw fear there, naked and unadorned. "Would you have us write in an official report that we were driven back by a creature of the old men's tales?" he asked. "That we, men of science and arms, fled before a single eye in the forest? Consider Almeida. Who would believe us? And if they did, what then? They would send more men, better armed to hunt it, to capture or kill. Do you wish that upon them?" I thought of the red eye in the dark, of the weight of its gaze, of the sound of its labored breathing. I thought of the crushed capybara, the snapped tree, the prints that sank deeper than my arm. The idea of men marching into that green labyrinth in pursuit of such a thing filled me with a cold, hollow dread. "No," I said quietly, "I do not." "Then we are agreed," Henderson said. "In our official account, we shall state that the terrain was more difficult than expected, the swamps impassable, the health of the party compromised. We shall mention the loss of the canoes to a fallen tree, but attribute it to rot. We shall say nothing of the rest." "And among ourselves?" Charpentier asked. "What do we say when we wake in the night with that smell in our nostrils?" Henderson's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but there was no humor in it. "Among ourselves," he said, "we may say what we please. We were there. We know what we know." In the end, that was the compromise we reached. The official report, which I helped draft upon our return to Manaus, was a dry document, full of distances and bearings and observations on soil composition. It recorded the loss of one canoe to a sudden arboreal failure, and noted in cautious language that the interior beyond a certain point appears unsuitable for profitable exploitation at present. It was accepted without much comment. There were other ventures, other rivers. Privately, the story spread in whispers among those who had cause to travel the upper Purus. Men spoke of a failed expedition, of something in the forest that had unsettled even hard-bitten soldiers. The word Mapinguari appeared in these murmurs, though rarely in my hearing. It was as if, by naming it, one invited its attention. Years passed. I left the employ of the rubber interests and took work with the Brazilian government, surveying rail routes in the south. I married briefly and was widowed. I grew older. Yet the memory of that red eye in the night did not fade. Rather, it settled into me, like a stone at the bottom of a well, its presence altering the sound of every thought that passed over it. There were times when I almost convinced myself that we had been mistaken, that exhaustion, fever, and the suggestibility of the human mind had combined to conjure a monster from shadows and stories. I read, when I could, the accounts of naturalists who had catalogued the fauna of the Amazon. I found references to the giant ground sloth, Megatherium, long extinct, its reconstructed skeletons looming in museum halls. Some theorized that the tales of great shaggy beasts in South American folklore were dim cultural memories of such creatures. I told myself that perhaps we had encountered some surviving relic of that age, a beast unknown to science, its appearance exaggerated by fear. That the red eye was a trick of light, the belly mouth an illusion of overlapping forms. This explanation, tenuous as it was, offered a kind of comfort. It placed the unknown within the realm of the merely undiscovered, rather than the impossible. Yet that explanation faltered whenever I recalled the way the forest itself had seemed to react. The silences, the absences, the way the very air had thickened. Animals do not command such responses. They are part of the fabric, not a rent in it. The first time the past returned to me with full force was in São Paulo, some 10 years after the expedition. I was walking home late from the office along a street lined with jacaranda trees. It had rained earlier and the air was cool, with that clean scent of wet stone and leaves. A cart had overturned near the market, spilling its load of offal from the slaughterhouse. The gutters ran with blood and scraps. As I passed, the smell rose, a thick, sour reek of old meat and bile. It struck me like a physical blow. For a moment, the street, the gas lamps, the distant sound of a tram, all vanished. I was again under the canopy, the fire a dim red glow, the air pressed upon my chest. I heard the wet dragging in the dark, the laboured breathing, the crack of a panicked rifle. I must have staggered, for a passerby caught my arm and asked if I was unwell. I managed some excuse about a sudden dizziness, but my hand shook so badly that I could not hold the key to my door steady when I reached my rooms. That night, I dreamt of the forest, not as it had been, but as something vaster, without end. I walked among trunks that rose like columns in a cathedral whose roof I could not see. Somewhere ahead, always just beyond sight, something moved, drawing me on. When I woke, my pillow was damp with sweat, and the city's sound seemed thin and insubstantial, like noises made in the next room of a house whose foundations rested on deeper things. Some years later, a letter reached me from Belém. It was from Charpentier. I had not seen him since Manaus, though I had heard that he had remained in Brazil, drawn back again and again to the forest that had so nearly broken him. He wrote in his precise, slanting hand that he had been collecting accounts of the Mapinguari from various tribes along the Rio Negro and the Madeira. The details varied, but certain elements recurred: the great size, the shaggy hair, the single eye, the mouth upon the belly, the odour of decay. Always there was the injunction that it hated the felling of trees, that it appeared where the forest was being cut. "I have tried," he wrote, "to reconcile these tales with some unknown animal, some misplaced sloth or bear. Yet the more I hear, the less I am convinced. It is not merely a beast to them. It is a guardian, or perhaps a punishment, a thing that is the forest in some way we do not comprehend. Do you remember the way the very insects fell silent, I wake sometimes with that silence in my ears. He asked if I would meet him in Manaus to speak further, to perhaps consider another expedition, better prepared, with more men, more firepower. At the bottom of the letter, his usually firm script had wavered. "I am torn," he confessed. "Part of me longs to see it again, to prove to myself that it was real. Another part hopes never to set eyes upon it. Tell me, old friend, where do you stand?" I did not go to Manaus. I wrote back a short, stiff letter saying that my health no longer permitted such journeys, that my duties in the south were pressing. The truth was simpler. I could not bring myself to step once more into that green immensity with the intention of seeking what we had fled. Some months later, I received word that Charpentier had died of fever in a camp along the Rio Madeira. The report was vague. There was mention of a violent storm, of trees falling in the night. No one spoke of red eyes or sour smells. Perhaps there were none. Or perhaps those who survived chose, as we had, to omit certain details. Of the others from our party, I saw only Paulo again by chance in a dockside tavern in Manaus, some years after the war in Europe had begun. He was older, his hair touched with grey, a scar running from his temple to his jaw. We recognized each other after a moment squinting through the tobacco smoke. We spoke cautiously at first, of trivialities, the price of rubber, the influx of foreign ships, the changes in the city. Then, inevitably, the conversation turned. "Do you remember," I began, "the old man in the village and what he drew?" Paulo's hand, which had been steady upon his cup, trembled slightly. "I remember," he said. "I have not gone upriver since, not that way." We fell silent. Around us, men laughed, argued, sang snatches of song. The river, just beyond the open door, flowed on, dark and imperturbable. After a time, he spoke again, very softly. "Others have gone," he said. "Not with you, with other bosses. Some have not returned. Those who do, they speak little. But I have heard things, of trees that fall without wind, of camps where the firewood rots in a single night, of a smell like the end of all things. The old men say the Mapinguari is angry, too many trees cut. Too much blood in the water." He looked at me, his eyes searching. "You saw it," he said. It was not a question. I held his gaze, and, for the first time since that night on the raft, spoke the truth without evasion. "Yes," I said. "I saw. I wish I had not. But I did." He nodded, as if I had confirmed something he had long suspected. We did not speak of it again. When we parted on the muddy street outside the tavern, he touched my arm. "Do not go back," he said, "even if they pay you much. Some places do not want men." I promised him I would not. It was an easy promise to keep. Now, in the quiet of my later years, far from the great river, I find myself returning in thought to that green corridor and to the thing that watched us from its shadows. I have read much in the interim, of new theories in biology, of the extinction of species, of the slow, relentless encroachment of men upon every corner of the earth. I have seen the photographs of jungles burned, of forests reduced to stumps and ash. Sometimes I wonder if, in some deep, inarticulate way, the tales of creatures like the Mapinguari are not merely fictions, but expressions of a truth we cannot otherwise face. That there are limits to what may be taken without consequence. That the world is not merely a collection of resources, but a living thing that may, in ways beyond our understanding, resist. I do not know what we saw in that camp by the tributary. I cannot prove that it was what the old man named. I have no photograph, no specimen, no plaster cast of those impossible tracks. The oily smear upon the leaf dried and flaked away before we reached the Purus. The only evidence that remains is the memory carried by a handful of men, most of whom are now dust. Yet in the still hours of the night, when the city's noises fade and the air lies heavy, there are moments when I wake with the certainty that something has passed nearby. The room is dark, the curtains unmoving. There is no sound, save perhaps the distant rumble of a carriage. But my heart races, and for an instant the air seems thick with a sourness that does not belong. In those moments, I lie very still and listen, as I did then, for the dragging tread, for the laboured breath, for the low, choking moan. None of these come, of course. The city is not the forest. The Mapinguari, if it exists, walks far from here, in places where the trees still stand unbroken. And yet, I cannot quite rid myself of the conviction that somewhere out there, under a canopy that has never known an axe, a great shaggy form moves between the trunks, slow and patient. That it pauses from time to time to press a vast, blunt hand against the bark of a caber, feeling for the vibrations of our distant industry. That it lifts its head, its single red eye opening in the gloom, and breathes in the changing air. What disturbs me most, after all these years, is not the memory of its gaze, nor the reek that heralded it, nor even the sound of trees breaking like matchsticks under its weight. It is the way the forest itself seemed to hold its breath when it drew near, as if in recognition. Sometimes, as I drift towards sleep, I find my thoughts returning to that first night when I woke to the silence and the dim glow of the embers. I see again the edge of the firelight, the darkness beyond, the slow emergence of a shape that should not be. And in that half-world between waking and dream, I feel, as keenly as I did then, the weight of a single, lidless eye opening in the dark, patient as time, waiting for us to look back.